Yesterday we spoke about the Prophet ﷺ on the epic journey of Isra and Mi'raj visiting Masjid al-Aqsa. And as we know that Isra and Mi'raj occurred roughly 3 years before Hijrah. And then 18 years later, which was in the 15th year after Hijrah, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu traveled to Masjid al-Aqsa and he was the liberator of the city. And the city remained in the hands of the Muslims for 477 years. And that is when the Crusades had taken place. So while we focus on the Crusades and we look at that particular era as a period of conflict between Muslims and Christians, but the issue between Muslims and Christians already started in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, where there were certain battles that took place with the Christians. Dhatul Salasil, Dawmatul Jund, the Battle of Tabuk, and the Battle of Yarmouk. These were all battles that took place against the Christians. But it was in 490 after Hijrah that Pope Urban II, in France, he delivered a fiery speech and he encouraged people to join an army to liberate Jerusalem from what he termed as the infidel Muslims. And he said to them that there lies the tomb of Jesus Christ. And whoever joins this army will attain paradise. The actual purpose for his call was that at that time there were two centers of Christianity. One was in the east, which was in Constantinople. And the other was in Rome, which is in the west. And there was always a feud between the two. Who's the real center power of Christianity? And in France and Italy at that time there was poverty. There was lack of resources. People were actually dying of famine. So the Pope saw this as an opportunity to bring in some revenue and to perhaps pillage the lands along the way, and that would be a means of gaining treasures for Christianity and getting the upper hand of the eastern headquarters of Christianity. So while Pope II delivered his fiery speech, and people were now eager to join the army, there was a hermit by the name of Peter, a bishop, and he immediately came forth and he said he will lead the army. And 15,000 people joined him. And the Pope was still going around mobilizing people when Peter already set off. And as he was moving along, his army was growing. He was a hermit, didn't have much interest in the world, so he was barefooted, riding a donkey. And despite his small stature, he was a very fiery orator who would give speeches along the way. And that is how the army grew to 88,000. And they marched off from Rome towards Istanbul, and from there into the lands of Anatolia. These people who had joined the army were all Bedouins, villagers, peasants. And when they came to Istanbul, they were then bedazzled by the city. So the governor of Istanbul at that time, the leader, put them to fight the Muslim Seljuks. And the Muslim Seljuk army finished them off. And this was the end of the First Crusade, which was an unsuccessful attempt on behalf of the Christians. Nevertheless, Pope Urban II continued his attempts to mobilize. And 2 years later, he was able to put together an army of knights, an army that had soldiers, an army that was well equipped. And they now set off again from Rome, traversing through Eastern Europe, through Istanbul, Constantinople, and into Anatolia. And there the Seljuks tried to resist. they were overcome, and the army proceeded southwards, capturing different provinces and kingdoms. Edessa, Antioch, and other places were captured along the way. And eventually the army reaches till outside Jerusalem. It camps outside Jerusalem. The Muslims are in Jerusalem. It is the time of the Shia Fatimiyat rule of Jerusalem. The Muslim Ummah is weak. It's the time of the Abbasid Khilafat. And each one is only concerned with their own mini kingdoms, their fiefdoms. Everyone is disunited. There's no central cooperation. So the Crusaders lay a siege on the city for 42 days. And as they're being worn down, they get reinforcements from the port of Haifa and Jaffa, from Rome. And they have what was not common at that time, what was a catapult, where they would fire a cannonball against the walls of the city. And after 42 days of siege, they were able to break into the city, and their army marched into the city of Jerusalem. And as they entered, they began the slaughter, decapitating the Muslims, chopping off their heads, killing mercilessly. Anyone that came in their path was immediately executed. Jews were burnt alive. Eventually, those who had been spared somewhat raced towards Masjid al-Aqsa to take refuge. And the knights entered into Masjid al-Aqsa. And they continued their slaughter to such an extent that there was so much blood in Masjid al-Aqsa that the blood reached the knees of the horses of the Crusaders. And in that blood, there were bodies floating and limbs of the body. Children were flung against the walls of the masjid. The stack of skulls reached so high that it was almost equivalent to the high walls of the city. And by the end of the day, there were 70,000 Muslims that were massacred, that were made shaheed. In comparison to how the Muslims had entered into the city, we look at how the Crusaders had entered the city. And then some of the Crusaders then returned, others remained behind. They then changed the Dome of the Rock, the name, the Qibli Musalla, and they made this a ammunition depot, a stable for the horses, a sty for the pigs, a dump. And that is how Masjid al-Aqsa had been transformed. No adhan was called, no salah was performed in the masjid. And that remained for a period of 88 years. The control of the Crusaders over Masjid al-Aqsa remained for that period. There were attempts of resistance here and there, but it wasn't sufficient. The invasion of Jerusalem sent shockwaves to the Muslim world, but Muslims are so weak they could do nothing. The Fatimiyat dynasty was also in control of portions of Egypt. They just surrendered and there was no pushback from their side. And that was the pitiable condition of the Muslim Ummah at that time. There were attempts by poets, by munshids, by orators to create awareness. Poetry was written, letters were presented to try and to stir up and to spark up something amongst the Muslims so that they must resist and they must push back. But all of this was in vain. And then in 532 after Hijrah, which was 40 years after the Crusaders had entered into Masjid al-Aqsa, that is when Salahudien Ayyubi was born. He was born to a Kurdish family that lived in Tikrit, which is on the western side of the Tigris River. And this was in a fort that was under Kurdish rule at that time. Salahuddin's father's name was Najmuddin, and he had an uncle by the name of Shirku. And it so happened that on the day when Salahuddin was born, that was the very day when Salahuddin's father and his uncle were told to leave the fort of Tikrit. And that is because there was a lady whose honor was violated, and Shirku had then killed that person. And the leader and the commander of the fort had said that it's best you leave, because then a cycle of revenge will then start. So Salahuddin was actually born in the Howdaj, in the carriage, while they were traveling away from Tikrit towards Mosul. And who was in Mosul? There was a leader by the name of Imaduddin Zangi, was part of the Zangi dynasty. And the reason why they chose to travel towards Mosul was that at one stage, Imaduddin was in a battle with an enemy, and he was defeated, and he was on the verge of being killed when Salahuddin's uncle had given him refuge in a fort, and therefore he owed them a favor, so they chose to travel to Mosul. That is where they were going to now settle. Imaduddin then received them in Mosul, and Salahuddin grew up in the city of Mosul. Salahuddin's father Najmuddin and his uncle Shirku then became part of the army of Imaduddin Zangi, and they joined the police forces. Salahuddin grew up in the city and would often visit different places where the Muslims would be training. It is said that when Salahuddin was about to be born, there was a voice, or it was in a dream, that his mother saw a vision, and it was told to her that in your womb is a sword from the swords of Allah. In your womb is a sword from the swords of Allah. So he grew up in an environment that was militarized. His mother would send him from a young age to the army barracks to see the soldiers training, to see how they clean the stables, to see them doing their archery and their sword fighting and all of that. And like that, he grew up in an environment that was focused on the upliftment and the protection of Deen. It is said that in the home of Salahuddin, there was never a day that passed except that there was the talk of the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa. And as time passed, his uncle and his father were part of the army of Najmuddin or Imaduddin Zangi. They then rised in the ranks, and as Salahuddin grew up, he became part of the police force. And he did well in terms of disciplining the people, the thieves of Syria, Damascus and Mosul. There's a poem that was recited that one of the thieves of Damascus wrote a letter to the others and say that beware of the person by the name of Yusuf. Because Salahuddin's actual name was Yusuf. It's Yusuf bin Najmuddin bin Shadi. So he said that beware of the one who has the name of the Nabi. The Nabi was the one who the ladies cut their hands when they saw him. And he is the one who cuts the hands of the thieves, warning them that they should cease their wretched activity. So at that time, he raised in the ranks and he disciplined the army. And Imaduddin saw talent in him. There was now a situation that was developing in Egypt, which was under the rule of the Fatimids. And there was some fighting amongst the rulers. So they actually asked Imaduddin Zangi that, can you send someone, a governor, who can help us rule over Egypt? So Egypt was under the rule of the Shias, the Fatimids, but they had asked for the support of Imaduddin Zangi, and he sent the uncle of Salahuddin, Shirku, and Salahuddin also then went along to Egypt. And in Egypt, Salahuddin was then in a position where he was taking care of certain things. And the people were not happy with how the Fatimids were ruling. And with his intervention, he removed certain taxes, he removed certain oppressive laws, and like that people became inclined to him. And there was more fighting amongst the Fatimids, and eventually Salahudien then rises to the position of becoming in charge. He takes control of Egypt. And while he's now in charge of Egypt, under the rule of Imaduddin Zangi, subsequently what happens is Imaduddin is assassinated, and then Nuruddin Zangi then takes over. While all of this is unfolding in Egypt, the Crusaders remain in control of Jerusalem. And they strengthen their rule. There are skirmishes here and there between the Crusaders and the Muslims. But now what is to happen after this is that there are certain events that unfold that leads to the ultimate showdown between the Muslim army of Salahuddin Ayyubi and the Crusaders. And that takes place in roughly 9 to 10 years after Salahuddin had taken control of Egypt. So inshallah tomorrow we'll talk about the Battle of Hittin and the subsequent battles, and then the events that lead to the recapture and the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.